War and Peace, Book 7, Chapter 7, read for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon. Toward evening, Ilegin took leave of Nicholas, who found that they were so far from home that he accepted "Uncle's" offer that the hunting party should spend the night in his little village of Mikhailovna. "And if you put up at my house, that will be better still. That's it, come on," said "Uncle." "You see it's damp weather, and you could rest, and the little countess could be driven home in a trap." "Uncle's" offer was accepted. A huntsman was sent to Otrádnoe for a trap, while Nicholas rode with Natásha and Pétya to "Uncle's" house. Some 5 male domestic serfs, big and little, rushed out to the front porch to meet their master. A score of women serfs, old and young, as well as children, popped out from the back entrance to have a look at the hunters who were arriving. The presence of Natásha, a woman, a lady, and on horseback, raised the curiosity of the serfs to such a degree that many of them came up to her, stared her in the face, and, unabashed by her presence, made remarks about her as though she were some prodigy on show, and not a human being able to hear or understand what was said about her. "Arinka! Look, she sits sideways! There she sits, and her skirt dangles. See, she's got a little hunting horn. Goodness gracious, see her knife? Isn't she a Tartar? How is it you didn't go head over heels?" asked the boldest of all, addressing Natásha directly. "Uncle" dismounted at the porch of his little wooden house, which stood in the midst of an overgrown garden, and, after a glance at his retainers, shouted authoritatively that the superfluous ones should take themselves off, and that all necessary preparations should be made to receive the guests and the visitors. The serfs all disappeared. "Uncle" lifted Natásha off her horse, and taking her hand led her up the rickety wooden steps of the porch. The house, with its bare, unplastered log walls, was not over clean. It did not seem that those living in it aimed at keeping it spotless. But neither was it noticeably neglected. In the entry there was a smell of fresh apples, and wolf and fox skins hung about. "Uncle" led the visitors through the anteroom into a small hall with a folding table and red chairs, then into the drawing room with a round birchwood table and a sofa, and finally into his private room, where there was a tattered sofa, a worn carpet, and portraits of Suvórov, of the host's father and mother, and of himself in military uniform. The study smelled strongly of tobacco and dogs. "Uncle" asked his visitors to sit down and make themselves at home, and then went out of the room. Rugáy, his back still muddy, came into the room and lay down on the sofa, cleaning himself with his tongue and teeth. Leading from the study was a passage in which a partition with ragged curtains could be seen. From behind this came women's laughter and whispers. Natásha, Nicholas, and Pétya took off their wraps and sat down on the sofa. Pétya, leaning on his elbow, fell asleep at once. Natásha and Nicholas were silent. Their faces glowed, they were hungry and very cheerful. They looked at one another. Now that the hunt was over and they were in the house, Nicholas no longer considered it necessary to show his manly superiority over his sister. Natásha gave him a wink, and neither refrained long from bursting into a peal of ringing laughter even before they had a pretext ready to account for it. After a while "Uncle" came in a Cossack coat, blue trousers, and small top boots. And Natásha felt that this costume, the very one she had regarded with surprise and amusement at Otrádnoe, was just the right thing, and not at all worse than a swallow-tail or frock-coat. "Uncle" too was in high spirits, and far from being offended by the brothers and sisters' laughter. It could never enter his head that they might be laughing at his way of life. He himself joined in the merriment. "That's right, young countess, that's it, come on. I never saw anyone like her," said he, offering Nicholas a pipe with a long stem, and, with a practiced motion of 3 fingers, taking down another that had been cut short. "She's ridden all day like a man and is as fresh as ever." Soon after "Uncle's" reappearance the door was opened, evidently from the sound, by a barefooted girl, and a stout, rosy, good-looking woman of about 40, with a double chin and full red lips, entered carrying a large loaded tray. With hospitable dignity and cordiality in her glance and in every motion, she looked at the visitors and, with a pleasant smile, bowed respectfully. In spite of her exceptional stoutness, which caused her to protrude her chest and stomach and throw back her head, this woman, who was "Uncle's" housekeeper, trod very lightly. She went to the table, set down the tray, and with her plump white hands deftly took from it the bottles and various hors d'oeuvres and dishes and arranged them on the table. When she had finished, she stepped aside and stopped at the door with a smile on her face. "Here I am. I am she. Now do you understand, uncle?" her expression said to Rostóv. How could one help understanding? Not only Nicholas, but even Natásha understood the meaning of his puckered brow and the happy complacent smile that slightly puckered his lips when Anísya Fëdorovna entered. On the tray was a bottle of herb wine, different kinds of vodka, pickled mushrooms, rye cakes made with buttermilk, honey in the comb, still mead and sparkling mead, apples, nuts, raw and roasted, and nut and honey sweets. Afterwards she brought a freshly roasted chicken, ham, preserves made with honey, and preserves made with sugar. All this was the fruit of Anísya Fëdorovna's housekeeping, gathered and prepared by her. The smell and taste of it all had a smack of Anísya Fëdorovna herself, a savor of juiciness, cleanliness, whiteness, and pleasant smiles. "Take this, little lady countess," she kept saying, as she offered Natásha first one thing and then another. Natásha ate of everything and thought she had never seen or eaten such buttermilk cakes, such aromatic jam, such honey and nut sweets, or such a chicken anywhere. Anísya Fëdorovna left the room. After supper, over their cherry brandy, Rostóv and "Uncle" talked of past and future hunts, of Rugáy and Ilágin's dogs, while Natásha sat upright on the sofa and listened with sparkling eyes. She tried several times to wake Pétya that he might eat something, but he only muttered incoherent words without waking up. Natásha felt so light-hearted and happy in these novel surroundings that she only feared the trap would come for her too soon. After a casual pause, such as often occurs when receiving friends for the first time in one's own house, "Uncle," answering a thought that was in his visitor's mind, said: "This, you see, is how I am finishing my days. Death will come. That's it, come on, nothing will remain. Then why harm anyone?" "Uncle's" face was very significant and even handsome as he said this. Involuntarily Rostóv recalled all the good he had heard about him from his father and the neighbors. Throughout the whole province "Uncle" had the reputation of being the most honorable and disinterested of cranks. They called him in to decide family disputes, chose him as executor, confided secrets to him, elected him to be a justice and to other posts, but he always persistently refused public appointments, passing the autumn and spring in the fields on his bay gelding, sitting at home in winter and lying in his overgrown garden in summer. "Why don't you enter the service, Uncle?" "I did once, but gave it up. I'm not fit for it. That's it, come on, I can't make head or tail of it. That's for you, I haven't brains enough. Now, hunting is another matter. That's it, come on. Open the door there," he shouted. "Why have you shut it?" The door at the end of the passage led to the huntsman's room, as they called the room for the hunt servants. There was a rapid patter of bare feet, and an unseen hand opened the door into the huntsman's room, from which came the clear sounds of a balalaika on which someone, who was evidently a master of the art, was playing. Natásha had been listening to those strains for some time, and now went out into the passage to hear better. "That's Mitka, my coachman. I've got him a good balalaika. I'm fond of it," said "Uncle." It was the custom for Mitka to play the balalaika in the huntsman's room when "Uncle" returned from the chase. "Uncle" was fond of such music. "How good! Really very good," said Nicholas, with some unintentional superciliousness, as if ashamed to confess that the sounds pleased him very much. "Very good?" said Natásha reproachfully, noticing her brother's tone. "Not very good. It's simply delicious." Just as "Uncle's" pickled mushrooms, honey, and cherry brandy had seemed to her the best in the world, so also that song, at that moment, seemed to her the acme of musical delight. "More, please more!" cried Natásha at the door as soon as the balalaika ceased. Mitka tuned up afresh and recommenced thrumming the balalaika to the air of "My Lady," with trills and variations. "Uncle" sat listening, slightly smiling, with his head on one side. The air was repeated 100 times. The balalaika was retuned several times and the same notes were thrummed again, but the listeners did not grow weary of it and wished to hear it again and again. Anísya Fëdorovna came in and leaned her portly person against the doorpost. "You like listening?" she said to Natásha, with a smile extremely like "Uncle's." "That's a good player of ours," she added. "He doesn't play that part right," said "Uncle" suddenly, with an energetic gesture. "Here he ought to burst out. That's it, come on, ought to burst out." "Do you play then?" asked Natásha. Uncle did not answer, but smiled. "Anisha, go and see if the strings of my guitar are all right. I haven't touched it for a long time. That's it, come on, I've given it up." Anísya Fëdorovna, with a light step, willingly went to fulfill her errand and brought back the guitar. Without looking at anyone, Uncle blew the dust off it and, tapping the case with his bony fingers, tuned the guitar and settled himself in his armchair. He took the guitar a little above the fingerboard, arching his left elbow with a somewhat theatrical gesture, and, with a wink at Anísya Fëdorovna, struck a single chord, pure and sonorous, and then quietly, smoothly and confidently began playing in very slow time. Not My Lady, but the well-known song, "Came a Maiden down the Street." The tune, played with precision and in exact time, began to thrill in the hearts of Nicholas and Natásha, arousing in them the same kind of sober mirth as radiated from Anísya Fëdorovna's whole being. Anísya Fëdorovna flushed and, drawing her kerchief over her face, went laughing out of the room. Uncle continued to play correctly, carefully, with energetic firmness, looking with a changed and inspired expression at the spot where Anísya Fëdorovna had just stood. Something seemed to be laughing a little on one side of his face under his grey moustaches, especially as the song grew brisker and the time quicker, and when, here and there, as he ran his fingers over the strings, something seemed to snap. "Lovely, lovely! Go on, Uncle, go on!" shouted Natásha as soon as he had finished. She jumped up and hugged and kissed him. "Nicholas, Nicholas!" she said, turning to her brother, as if asking him, "What is it moves me so?" Nicholas too was greatly pleased by Uncle's playing, and Uncle played the piece over again. Anísya Fëdorovna's smiling face reappeared in the doorway, and behind hers other faces. "Fetching water clear and sweet, stop, dear maiden, I entreat," played Uncle once more, running his fingers skillfully over the strings. Then he stopped short and jerked his shoulders. "Go on, Uncle dear!" Natásha wailed in an imploring tone as if her life depended on it. Uncle rose, and it was as if there were two men in him. One of them smiled seriously at the merry fellow, while the merry fellow struck a naive and precise attitude preparatory to a folk dance. "Now then, niece!" he exclaimed, waving to Natásha the hand that had just struck a chord. Natásha threw off the shawl from her shoulders, ran forward to face Uncle, and setting her arms akimbo, also made a motion with her shoulders and struck an attitude. Where, how, and when had this young countess, educated by an émigré French governess, imbibed from the Russian air she breathed that spirit and obtained that manner which the pas de châle, or the French shawl dance, would, one would have supposed, long ago have effaced? But the spirit and the movements were those inimitable and unteachable Russian ones that Uncle had expected of her. As soon as she had struck her pose and smiled triumphantly, proudly, and with sly merriment, the fear that had at first seized Nicholas and the others that she might not do the right thing was at an end, and they were already admiring her. She did the right thing with such precision, such complete precision, that Anísya Fëdorovna, who had at once handed her the handkerchief she needed for the dance, had tears in her eyes, though she laughed as she watched this slim, graceful countess, reared in silks and velvets and so different from herself, who yet was able to understand all that was in Anísya and in Anísya's father and mother and aunt, and in every Russian man and woman. "Well, little countess, that's it, come on!" cried Uncle, with a joyous laugh, having finished the dance. "Well done, niece! Now a fine young fellow must be found as husband for you. That's it, come on!" "He's chosen already," said Nicholas, smiling. "Oh?" said Uncle in surprise, looking inquiringly at Natásha, who nodded her head with a happy smile. "And such a one!" she said, but as soon as she had said it, a new train of thoughts and feelings arose in her. What did Nicholas' smile mean when he said chosen already? Is he glad of it or not? It is as if he thought my Bolkónski would not approve of or understand our gaiety. But he would understand it all. Where is he now? She thought, and her face suddenly became serious. But this lasted only a second. "Don't dare to think about it," she said to herself, and sat down again smilingly beside Uncle, begging him to play something more. Uncle played another song and a valse, then after a pause he cleared his throat and sang his favorite hunting song. "As 'twas growing dark last night, fell the snow so soft and light." Uncle sang as peasants sing, with full and naïve conviction that the whole meaning of a song lies in the words, and that the tune comes of itself, and that apart from the words there is no tune, which exists only to give measure to the words. As a result of this, the unconsidered tune, like the song of a bird, was extraordinarily good. Natásha was in ecstasies over Uncle's singing. She resolved to give up learning the harp and to play only the guitar. She asked Uncle for his guitar and at once found the chords of the song. After 9 o'clock, 2 traps and 3 mounted men, who had been sent to look for them, arrived to fetch Natásha and Pétya. The Count and Countess did not know where they were and were very anxious, said one of the men. Pétya was carried out like a log and laid in the larger of the 2 traps. Natásha and Nicholas got into the other. Uncle wrapped Natásha up warmly and took leave of her with quite a new tenderness. He accompanied them on foot as far as the bridge that could not be crossed, so that they had to go round by the ford, and he sent huntsmen to ride in front with lanterns. "Good-bye, dear niece," his voice called out of the darkness, not the voice Natásha had known previously, but the one that had sung "As 'twas growing dark last night." In the village through which they passed there were red lights and a cheerful smell of smoke. "What a darling Uncle is!" said Natásha, when they had come out onto the high road. "Yes," returned Nicholas. "You're not cold?" "No, I'm quite all right. I feel so comfortable," answered Natásha, almost perplexed by her feelings. They remained silent a long while. The night was dark and damp. They could not see the horses, but only heard them splashing through the unseen mud. What was passing in that receptive childlike soul that so eagerly caught and assimilated all the diverse impressions of life? How did they all find place in her? But she was very happy. As they were nearing home she suddenly struck up the air of "As 'twas growing dark last night," the tune of which she had all the way been trying to get, and had at last caught. "Got it?" said Nicholas. "What were you thinking about just now, Nicholas?" inquired Natásha. They were fond of asking one another that question. "I?" said Nicholas, trying to remember. "Well, you see, first I thought that Rugáy, the red hound, was like Uncle, and that if he were a man he would always keep Uncle near him, if not for his riding, then for his manner. What a good fellow Uncle is! Don't you think so? Well, and you?" "I? Wait a bit, wait. Yes, first I thought that we are driving along and imagining that we are going home, but that heaven knows where we are really going in the darkness, and that we shall arrive and suddenly find that we are not in Otrádnoe but in Fairyland. And then I thought... No, nothing else." "I know, I expect you thought of him," said Nicholas, smiling, as Natásha knew by the sound of his voice. "No," said Natásha, though she had in reality been thinking about Prince Andrew at the same time as of the rest, and of how he would have liked Uncle. "And then I was saying to myself all the way, 'How well Anísya carried herself, how well!'" And Nicholas heard her spontaneous, happy, ringing laughter. "And do you know," she suddenly said, "I know that I shall never again be as happy and tranquil as I am now." "Rubbish! Nonsense! Humbug!" exclaimed Nicholas, and he thought, "How charming this Natásha of mine is! I have no other friend like her and never shall have. Why should she marry? We might always drive about together." "What a darling this Nicholas of mine is!" thought Natásha. "Ah, there are still lights in the drawing-room," she said, pointing to the windows of the house that gleamed invitingly in the moist velvety darkness of the night. Chapter 7.
War and Peace, Book 7, Chapter 8. Recording by Eva Harnick. Count Ilyá Rostov had resigned the position of Marshal of the Nobility because it involved him in too much expense, but still his affairs did not improve. Natásha and Nicholas often noticed their parents conferring together anxiously and privately, and heard suggestions of selling the fine ancestral Rostov house and estate near Moscow. It was not necessary to entertain so freely as when the count had been marshal, and life at Otradno was quieter than in former years, but still the enormous house and its lodges were full of people, and more than 20 sat down to table every day. These were all their own people, who had settled down in the house almost as members of the family, or persons who were, it seemed, obliged to live in the count's house. Such were Dimmler, the musician and his wife, Vogel, the dancing master and his family, Belova, an old maiden lady and inmate of the house, and many others, such as Petya's tutors, the girl's former governess, and other people who simply found it preferable and more advantageous to live in the count's house than at home. They had not as many visitors as before, but the old habits of life, without which the count and countess could not conceive of existence, remained unchanged. There was still the hunting establishment, which Nicholas had even enlarged, the same 50 horses and 15 grooms in the stables, the same expensive presents and dinner parties to the whole district on name days. There were still the count's games of whist and Boston, at which, spreading out his cards so that everybody could see them, he let himself be plundered of hundreds of rubles every day by his neighbors, who looked upon an opportunity to play a rubber with Count Rostov as a most profitable source of income. The count moved in his affairs as in a huge net, trying not to believe that he was entangled, but becoming more and more so at every step, and feeling too feeble to break the meshes or to set to work carefully and patiently to disentangle them. The countess, with her loving heart, felt that her children were being ruined, that it was not the count's fault, for he could not help being what he was, that though he tried to hide it, he himself suffered from the consciousness of his own and his children's ruin, and she tried to find means of remedying the position. From her feminine point of view, she could see only one solution, namely for Nicholas to marry a rich heiress. She felt this to be their last hope, and that if Nicholas refused the match she had found for him, she would have to abandon the hope of ever getting matters right. This match was with Julie Karagina, the daughter of excellent and virtuous parents, a girl the Rostóvs had known from childhood, and who had now become a wealthy heiress through the death of the last of her brothers. The countess had written direct to Julie's mother in Moscow, suggesting a marriage between their children, and had received a favorable answer from her. Karagina had replied that for her part she was agreeable, and everything would depend on her daughter's inclination. She invited Nicholas to come to Moscow. Several times the countess, with tears in her eyes, told her son that now both her daughters were settled, her only wish was to see him married. She said she could lie down in her grave peacefully if that were accomplished. Then she told him that she knew of a splendid girl and tried to discover what he thought about marriage. At other times she praised Julie to him and advised him to go to Moscow during the holidays to amuse himself. Nicholas guessed what his mother's remarks were leading to, and during one of these conversations induced her to speak quite frankly. She told him that her only hope of getting their affairs disentangled now lay in his marrying Julie Karagina. "But, Mamma, suppose I love the girl who has no fortune. Would you expect me to sacrifice my feelings and my honor for the sake of money?" he asked his mother, not realizing the cruelty of his question and only wishing to show his noble-mindedness. "No, you have not understood me," said his mother, not knowing how to justify herself. "You have not understood me, Nikolenka. It is your happiness I wish for," she added, feeling that she was telling an untruth and was becoming entangled. She began to cry. "Mamma, don't cry. Only tell me that you wish it, and you know I will give my life, anything to put you at ease," said Nicholas. "I would sacrifice anything for you, even my feelings." But the countess did not want a question put like that. She did not want a sacrifice from her son. She herself wished to make a sacrifice for him. "No, you have not understood me. Don't let us talk about it," she replied, wiping away her tears. "Maybe I do love a poor girl," said Nicholas to himself. "Am I to sacrifice my feelings and my honor for money? I wonder how Mamma could speak so to me. Because Sónya is poor, I must not love her," he thought, "must not respond to her faithful, devoted love. Yet I should certainly be happier with her than with some doll like Julie. I can always sacrifice my feelings for my family's welfare," he said to himself. "But I can't coerce my feelings. If I love Sónya, that feeling is for me stronger and higher than all else." Nicholas did not go to Moscow, and the countess did not renew the conversation with him about marriage. She saw with sorrow, and sometimes with exasperation, symptoms of a growing attachment between her son and the portionless Sónya. Though she blamed herself for it, she could not refrain from grumbling at and worrying Sónya, often pulling her up without reason, addressing her stiffly as "my dear," and using the formal "you" instead of the intimate "thou" in speaking to her. The kind-hearted countess was the more vexed with Sónya because that poor dark-eyed niece of hers was so meek, so kind, so devotedly grateful to her benefactors, and so faithfully, unchangingly, and unselfishly in love with Nicholas, that there were no grounds for finding fault with her. Nicholas was spending the last of his leave at home. A fourth letter had come from Prince Andrew from Rome, in which he wrote that he would have been on his way back to Russia long ago had not his wound unexpectedly reopened in the warm climate, which obliged him to defer his return till the beginning of the new year. Natasha was still as much in love with her betrothed, found the same comfort in that love, and was still as ready to throw herself into all the pleasures of life as before. But at the end of the 4th month of their separation she began to have fits of depression which she could not master. She felt sorry for herself, sorry that she was being wasted all this time and of no use to anyone, while she felt herself so capable of loving and being loved. Things were not cheerful in the Rostóvs' home. End of chapter 8. Recording by Eva Harnick, Ponte Vedra, Florida.
Book 7, Chapter 9, read for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon. Christmas came, and, except for the ceremonial mass, the solemn and wearisome Christmas congratulations from neighbors and servants, and the new dresses everyone put on, there were no special festivities, though the calm frost of 20 degrees Réaumur The dazzling sunshine by day and the starlight of the winter nights seemed to call for some special celebration of the season. On the third day of Christmas week, after the midday dinner, all the inmates of the house dispersed to various rooms. It was the dullest time of the day. Nicholas, who had been visiting some neighbors that morning, was asleep on the sitting-room sofa. The old count was resting in his study. Sónya sat in the drawing-room at the round table, copying a design for embroidery. The countess was playing patience. Nastasia Ivanovna, the buffoon, sat with a sad face at the window with two old ladies. Natásha came into the room, went up to Sónya, glanced at what she was doing, and then went up to her mother and stood without speaking. "Why are you wandering about like an outcast?" asked her mother. "What do you want?" "Him, I want him. Now, this minute, I want him," said Natásha, with glittering eyes and no sign of a smile. The countess lifted her head and looked attentively at her daughter. "Don't look at me, Mamma. Don't look, I shall cry directly." "Sit down with me a little," said the countess. "Mamma, I want him. Why should I be wasted like this, Mamma?" Her voice broke, tears gushed from her eyes, and she turned quickly to hide them and left the room. She passed into the sitting-room, stood there thinking a while, and then went into the maid's room. There an old maidservant was grumbling at a young girl who stood panting, having just run in through the cold from the serfs' quarters. "Stop playing, there's a time for everything," said the old woman. "Let her alone, Kondratevna," said Natásha. "Go, Mavrúshka, go." Having released Mavrúshka, Natásha crossed the dancing hall and went to the vestibule. There an old footman and two young ones were playing cards. They broke off and rose as she entered. "What can I do with them?" thought Natásha. "Oh, Nikita, please go... Where can I send him? Yes, go to the yard and fetch a fowl, please, a cock. And you, Misha, bring me some oats." "Just a few oats?" said Misha, cheerfully and readily. Go quickly," the old man urged him. "And you, Theodore, get me a piece of chalk." On her way past the butler's pantry she told them to set a samovar, though it was not at all the time for tea. Foka, the butler, was the most ill-tempered person in the house. Natásha liked to test her power over him. He distrusted the order and asked whether the samovar was really wanted. "Oh dear, what a young lady!" said Foka, pretending to frown at Natásha. No one in the house sent people about or gave them as much trouble as Natásha did. She could not see people unconcernedly, but had to send them on some errand. She seemed to be trying whether any of them would get angry or sulky with her, but the serfs fulfilled no one's orders so readily as they did hers. "What can I do? Where can I go?" thought she, as she went slowly along the passage. "Nastasia Ivanovna, what sort of children shall I have?" she asked the buffoon, who was coming toward her in a woman's jacket. "Why, fleas, crickets, grasshoppers," answered the buffoon. Oh Lord, it's always the same. Oh, where am I to go? What am I to do with myself?" And, tapping with her heels, she ran quickly upstairs to see Vogel and his wife, who lived on the upper story. Two governesses were sitting with the Vogels at a table on which were plates of raisins, walnuts, and almonds. The governesses were discussing whether it was cheaper to live in Moscow or Odessa. Natásha sat down, listened to their talk with a serious and thoughtful air, and then got up again. "The island of Madagascar," she said. "Madagascar," she repeated, articulating each syllable distinctly, and, not replying to Madame Schoss, who asked her what she was saying, she went out of the room. Her brother Pétya was upstairs too. With a man in attendance on him, he was preparing fireworks to let off that night. "Pétya! Pétya!" she called to him. "Carry me downstairs." Pétya ran up and offered her his back. She jumped on it, putting her arms round his neck, and he pranced along with her. "No, don't! The island of Madagascar," she said, and, jumping off his back, she went downstairs. Having, as it were, reviewed her kingdom, tested her power, and made sure that everyone was submissive, but that all the same it was dull, Natásha betook herself to the ballroom, picked up her guitar, sat down in a dark corner behind a bookcase, and began to run her fingers over the strings in the bass, picking out a passage she recalled from an opera she had heard in Petersburg with Prince Andrew. What she drew from the guitar would have had no meaning for other listeners, but in her imagination a whole series of reminiscences arose from those sounds. She sat behind the bookcase with her eyes fixed on a stream of light escaping from the pantry door, and listened to herself and pondered. She was in a mood for brooding on the past. Sónya passed to the pantry with a glass in her hand. Natásha glanced at her and at the crack in the pantry door, and it seemed to her that she remembered the light falling through that crack once before, and Sónya passing with a glass in her hand. Yes, it was exactly the same, thought Natásha. "Sónya, what is this?" she cried, twanging a thick string. "Oh, you're there," said Sónya with a start, and came near and listened. "I don't know. A storm?" she ventured timidly, afraid of being wrong. "There! That's just how she started and just how she came up smiling timidly when all this happened before," thought Natásha, "and in just the same way I thought there was something lacking in her." "No, it's the chorus from the water carrier. Listen!" And Natásha sang the air of the chorus so that Sónya should catch it. "Where were you going?" she asked. "To change the water in this glass. I'm just finishing the design." "You always find something to do, but I can't," said Natásha. "And where's Nicholas?" "Asleep, I think." "Sónya, go and wake him," said Natásha. "Tell him I want him to come and sing." She sat a while, wondering what the meaning of it all having happened before could be, and without solving this problem, or at all regretting not having done so, she again passed in fancy to the time when she was with him and he was looking at her with a lover's eyes. "Oh, if only he would come quicker! I'm so afraid it will never be. And, worst of all, I'm growing old. That's the thing. There won't then be in me what there is now. But perhaps he'll come today, will come immediately. Perhaps he has come and is sitting in the drawing room. Perhaps he came yesterday and I've forgotten it." She rose, put down the guitar, and went to the drawing room. All the domestic circle, tutors, governesses, and guests, were already at the tea table. The servants stood round the table, but Prince Andrew was not there, and life was going on as before. "Ah, here she is," said the old count when he saw Natásha enter. "Well, sit down by me." But Natásha stayed by her mother and glanced round as if looking for something. "Mamma," she muttered, "give him to me. Give him, Mamma, quickly, quickly!" And she again had difficulty in repressing her sobs. She sat down at the table and listened to the conversation between the elders and Nicholas, who had also come to the table. My God! My God! The same faces, the same talk, Papa holding his cup and blowing in the same way," thought Natásha, feeling with horror a sense of repulsion rising up in her for the whole household, because they were always the same. After tea, Nicholas, Sónya, and Natásha went to the sitting room, to their favorite corner, where their most intimate talks always began. End of chapter 9.
War and Peace, Book 7, Chapter 10, read for LibriVox.org, by Elena. Chapter 10. "Does it ever happen to you," said Natásha to her brother when they settled down in the sitting room, "does it ever happen to you to feel as if there was nothing more to come, nothing, that everything good is past, and to feel not exactly dull, but sad?" "I should think so," he replied. "I have felt like that when everything was all right and everyone was cheerful. The thought has come into my mind that I was already tired of it all, and that we must all die. Once in the regiment I had not gone to some merrymaking where there was music, and suddenly I felt so depressed." "Oh yes, I know," Natásha interrupted him. "When I was quite little that used to be so with me. Do you remember when I was punished about some plums? You were all dancing and I sat sobbing in the schoolroom. I shall never forget it. I felt sad and sorry for everyone, for myself and for everyone. And I was innocent, that was the chief thing. Do you remember?" "I remember," answered Nicholas. "I remember that I came to you afterwards and wanted to comfort you, but, you know, I felt ashamed to. We were terribly absurd. I had a funny doll then, I wanted to give it to you. Do you remember?" And do you remember, Natasha asked with a pensive smile, how once, long, long ago, when we were quite little, Uncle called us into the study. That was in the old house, and it was dark, and we went in, and suddenly there stood a negro, chimed in Nicholas with a smile of delight. Of course I remember. Even now I don't know whether it really was a negro, or if we only dreamt it, or were told about him. He was grey, you remember, and had white teeth, and stood and looked at us. Sonia, do you remember? Asked Nicholas. Yes, yes, I do remember something too, Sonia answered timidly. You know I have asked Papa and Mama about that negro, said Natasha, and they said there was no negro at all. But you see, you remember. Of course I do. I remember his teeth as if I'd just seen them. How strange is that? It was as if it were like a dream. I like that. And do you remember how we rolled hard-boiled eggs in the ballroom, and suddenly 2 old women began spinning around on the carpet? Was that real or not? Do you remember what fun it was? Yes, and you remember how Papa in his blue overcoat fired a gun into the porch? And so they went through their memories, smiling with pleasure, not the sad memories of old age, but poetic, youthful ones, those impressions of one's most distant past, in which dreams and realities blend, and they laughed with quiet enjoyment. Sonia, as always, did not quite keep pace with them, though they shared the same reminiscences. Much that they remembered had slipped from her mind, and what she recalled did not arouse the same poetic feeling as they experienced. She simply enjoyed their pleasure and tried to fit in with it. She only really took part when they recalled Sonia's first arrival. She told them how afraid she had been of Nicholas because he had on a corded jacket, and her nurse had told her that she, too, would be sewn up with cords. And remember their telling me that you had been born under a cabbage, said Natasha, and I remember that I dared not disbelieve it then, but I knew it not to be true, and I felt so uncomfortable. When they were talking, a maid thrust her head in the other door of the sitting room. "They have brought the cock, miss," she said in a whisper. "It isn't wanted, Petya. Tell them to take it away," replied Natasha. In the middle of their talk in the sitting-room, Dimmler came in and went up to the harp that stood in the corner. He took off its cloth covering, and the harp gave out a jarring sound. "Mr. Dimmler, please play my favourite nocturne by Field," came the old countess's voice from the drawing-room. Dimmler struck a chord, and turning to Natasha, Nicholas and Sonia, remarked, "How quiet you young people are." "Yes, we're philosophizing," said Natasha, glancing around for a moment, and then continuing the conversation. They were now discussing dreams. Dimmler began to play. Natasha went on tiptoe noiselessly to the table, took up a candle, carried it out, and returned, seating herself quietly in her former place. It was dark in the room, especially where they were sitting on the sofa, but through the big windows the silvery light of the full moon fell on the floor. Dimmler had finished the piece, but still sat softly running his fingers over the strings, evidently uncertain whether to stop or to play something else. "Did you know," said Natasha in a whisper, moving closer to Nicholas and Sonia, "that when one goes on and on recalling memories, one at last begins to remember what happened before one was in the world?" "That's metempsychosis," said Sonia, who had always been learned well, and remembered everything. "The Egyptians believed that our souls have lived in animals and will go back into animals again." "No, I don't believe we ever were in animals," said Natasha, still in a whisper, though the music had ceased. "But I am certain that we were angels somewhere there, and have been here, and that's why we remember." "May I join you?" said Dimmler, who had come up quietly, and he sat down by them. "If we have been angels, why have we fallen lower?" said Nicholas. "No, that can't be." "Not lower? Who said we were lower? How do I know what I was before?" Natasha rejoined with conviction. "The soul is immortal. Well, then, if I shall always live, I must have lived before. lived for a whole eternity. "Yes, but it is hard for us to imagine eternity," remarked Dimmler, who had joined the young folk with a mildly condescending smile, but now spoke as quietly and as seriously as they. "Why is it hard to imagine eternity?" said Natasha. "It is now today, and it will be tomorrow, and always, and there was yesterday and the day before." "Natasha, now it's your turn. Sing me something," they heard the Countess say. "Why are you sitting there like conspirators?" "Mamma, I don't want to." But all the same she rose. None of them, not even the middle-aged Dimmler, wanted to break off their conversation and quit that quiet corner of the sitting-room. But Natasha got up and Nicholas sat down at the clavichord. Standing as usual in the middle of the hall and choosing the place where the resonance was best, Natasha began to sing her mother's favourite song. She had said that she did not want to sing, but it was long since she had sung, and long before she again sang, as she did that evening. The Count, from his study where he was talking to Mityenka, heard her and, like a schoolboy in a hurry to run out to play, blundered in his talk while giving orders to the steward, and at last stopped while Mityenka stood in front of him also listening and smiling. Nicholas did not take his eyes off his sister and drew breath in time with her. Sonia, as she listened, thought of the immense difference there was between herself and her friend, and how impossible it was for her to be anything like as bewitching as her cousin. The old Countess sat with a blissful yet sad smile, and with tears in her eyes, and occasionally shaking her head. She thought of Natasha and of her own youth, and of how there was something unnatural and dreadful about this impending marriage of Natasha and Prince Andrew. Dimmler, who had seated himself beside the Countess, listened with closed eyes. "Ah, Countess," he said at last, "that's a European talent. She has nothing to learn. What softness, tenderness, and strength!" "Ah, how afraid I am for her, how afraid I am," said the Countess, not really realizing to whom she was speaking. Her maternal instinct told her that Natasha had too much of something, and that because of this she would not be happy. Before Natasha had finished singing, 14-year-old Petya rushed in delightedly to say that some mammas had arrived. Natasha stopped abruptly. "Idiot!" she screamed at her brother, and running to a chair, threw herself on it, sobbing so violently she could not stop for a long time. "It's nothing, Mamma, really it's nothing, only Petya startled me," she said, trying to smile. But her tears still flowed and sobs still choked her. The mammas, some of the house served, dressed up as bears, Turks, innkeepers and ladies, frightening and funny, bringing in with them the cold from outside, and a feeling of gaiety, crowded, at first timidly, into the anteroom. Then hiding behind one another they pushed into the ballroom where, shyly at first, and then more and more merrily and heartily, they started singing, dancing, and playing Christmas games. The Countess, when she had identified them and laughed at their costumes, went into the drawing-room. The Count sat at the ballroom, smiling radiantly and applauding the players. The young people had disappeared. Half an hour later there appeared among the other mammas in the ballroom an old lady in a hoop skirt. This was Nicholas. A Turkish girl. This was Petya. A clown was Dimmler. A hussar was Natasha. And a Circassian was Sonia, with burnt cork moustache and eyebrows. After the condescending surprise and non-recognition and praise from those who were not themselves dressed up, the young people decided that their costumes were so good that they ought to be shown elsewhere. Nicholas, who, as the roads were in splendid condition, wanted to take them all for a drive in his troika, proposed to take with them about a dozen of the serf mammas and drive to Uncle's. "No, why disturb the fellow?" said the Countess. "Besides, you wouldn't have room to turn around there. If you must go, go to the Meliukovs." Meliukova was a widow who, with her family and their tutors and governesses, lived 3 miles from the Rostovs. "That's right, my dear," chimed in the old Count. thoroughly aroused. "I'll dress up at once and go with them. I'll make Bichette open her eyes." But the Countess would not agree to his going. He had had a bad leg all these days. It was decided that the Count must not go, but that if Louise Ivanovna, Madame Schoss, would go with them, the young ladies might go to the Meliukovs. Sonia, generally so timid and shy, more urgently than anyone begging Louise Ivanovna not to refuse. Sonia's costume was the best of all. Her moustache and eyebrows were extraordinarily becoming. Everyone told her she looked very handsome, and she was in a spirited and energetic mood unusual with her. Some inner voice told her that now or never her fate would be decided, and in her male attire she seemed quite a different person. Louise Ivanovna consented to go, and in half an hour 4 troika sleighs with large and small bells, their runners squeaking and whistling over the frozen snow, drove up to the porch. Natasha was the foremost in setting the merry holiday tone, which, passing from one to another, grew stronger and reached its climax when they all came out into the frost and got into the sleighs, talking and calling to one another, laughing and shouting. 2 of the troikas were the usual household sleighs, and the third was the old Count's with a trotter from the Orlov stud at the shaft horse, and the 4th was Nicholas's own with a short, shaggy black shaft horse. Nicholas, in his old lady's dress, over which he had belted his hussar coat, stood in the middle of the sleigh, reins in hand. It was so light that he could see the moonlight reflected from the metal harness discs and from the eyes of the horses, who looked around in alarm at the noisy party under the shadow of the porch roof. Natasha, Sonia, Madame Schoss, and 2 maids got into Nicholas's sleigh, Dimmler, his wife, and Petya into the old Count's, and the rest of the mummers seated themselves in the other 2 sleighs. "You go ahead, Zakhar!" shouted Nicholas to his father's coachman, wishing for a chance to race past him. The old Count's troika, with Dimmler and his party, started forward, squeaking on its runners, as though freezing to the snow, its deep-toned bell clanging. The side horses, pressing against the shafts of the middle horses, sank in the snow, which was dry and glittering like sugar, and threw it up. Nicholas set off, following the first sleigh, moved noisily, their runners squeaking. At first they drove at a steady trot along the narrow road. While they drove past the garden, the shadows of the bare trees often fell across the road and hid the brilliant moonlight, but as soon as they were past the fence, the snowy plain bathed in moonlight, and motionless spread out before them, glittering like diamonds and dappled with bluish shadows. Bang, bang went the first sleigh over a cradle hole in the snow of the road, and each of the other sleighs jolted in the same way. And rudely breaking the frost-bound stillness, the troikas began to speed along the road, one after the other. "A hare's track! A lot of tracks!" rang out Natasha's voice through the frost-bound air. "How light it is, Nicholas!" came Sonia's voice. Nicholas glanced around at Sonia and bent over to see her face closer. Quite a new, sweet face, with black eyebrows and moustaches, peeped up at him from her sable furs, so close and yet so distant in the moonlight. That used to be Sonia, he thought, and he looked at her closer and smiled. "What is it, Nicholas?" "Nothing," he said, and turned again to the horses. When they came out onto the beaten high road, polished by sleigh runners and cut up by rough-shod hoofs, the marks of which were visible in the moonlight, the horses began to tug at the reins of their own accord and increased their pace. The near side horse, arching his head and breaking into a short canter, tugged at his traces. The shaft horse swayed from side to side, moving his ears as if asking, "Isn't it time to begin now?" In front, already far ahead, the deep bell of the sleigh ringing farther and farther off, the black horses, driven by Zakhar, could clearly be seen against the white snow. From that sleigh one could hear shouts, laughter, and voices of the mummers. "Gee up, my darlings!" shouted Nicholas, pulling the reins to one side and flourishing the whip. It was only by the keener wind that met them and the jerks given by the side horses who pulled harder, ever increasing their gallop, that one noticed how fast the troika was flying. Nicholas looked back. With screams, squeals, and waving of whips that caused even the shaft horses to gallop, the other sleighs followed. The shaft horse swung steadily beneath the bow over its head, with no thought of slackening pace, and ready to put on speed when required. Nicholas overtook the first sleigh. They were driving downhill and coming out on a broad trodden track across a meadow near a river. "Where are we?" thought. "This is Kossoy Meadow, I suppose, but no, this is something new I've never seen before. Isn't Kossoy Meadow nor the Demkin Hill, and heaven only knows what it is. It is something new and enchanted. Well, whatever it may be," and shouting to his horses, he began to pass the first sleigh. Zakhar held back his horses and turned his face, which was already covered with hoarfrost, to his eyebrows. Nicholas gave the horses the rein, and Zakhar, stretching out his arms, clucked his tongue and let his horses go. "Now look out, master!" he cried. Faster still the two troikas flew side by side, and faster moved the feet of the galloping side horses. Nicholas began to draw ahead. Zakhar, while still keeping his arms extended, raised one hand with the reins. "No, you won't, master!" he shouted. Nicholas put all his horses to a gallop and passed Zakhar. The horses showered with fine dry snow on the faces of those in the sleigh. Besides them sounded quick ringing bells, and they caught confusing glimpses of swiftly moving legs and the shadows of the troika they were passing. The whistling sounds of the runners on the snow and the voices of girls shrieking were heard from the different sides. Checking again his horses, Nicholas looked around him. They were still surrounded by the magical plain bathed in moonlight and spangled with stars. "The car is shouting that I should turn to the left, but why to the left?" thought Nicholas. "Aren't we getting to the Meliukovs? Is this Meliukovka? Heaven only knows where we're going, and heaven knows what is happening to us, but it is very strange and pleasant, whatever it is." He looked around the sleigh. "Look, his moustache and eyelashes are all white," said one of the strange, pretty, unfamiliar people, the one with fine eyebrows and a moustache. "I think this used to be Natasha," thought Nicholas, "and that was Madame Schoss, but perhaps it is not, and this Circassian with the moustache, I don't know, but I love her." "Aren't you cold?" he asked. They did not answer, but began to laugh. Dimmler from the sleigh behind shouted something, probably something funny, but they could not make out what it was. "Yes, yes," some voices answered, laughing. But here was a fairy forest with black moving shadows and a glitter of diamonds and a flight of marble steps and the silver roofs of fairy buildings and the shrill yells of some animals. And if this really is Meliukovka, it is still stranger that we drove heaven knows where and have come to Meliukovka, thought Nicholas. It really was Meliukovka, and the maids and footmen with merry faces came running out to the porch carrying candles. "Who is it?" asked someone on the porch. "The mummers from the Count's, I know from the horses," replied the voices. End of chapter 10. War and Peace, Book 7, Chapter 11. Read for LibriVox.org by Elena. Pelagaya Danilovna Meliukova, a broadly built, energetic woman, wearing spectacles, sat in the drawing-room in a loose dress, surrounded by her daughters, whom she was trying to keep from feeling dull. They were quietly dropping melted wax into snow and looking at the shadows the wax figures would throw on the wall, when they heard the steps and voices of the new arrivals in the vestibule. Hussars, ladies, witches, clowns, and bears, after clearing their throats and wiping the hoarfrost from their faces in the vestibule, came into the ballroom where candles were hurriedly lighted. The clown, Dimmler, and the lady, Nicholas, started to dance, surrounded by the screaming children, and the mummers, covering their faces and disguising their voices, bowing to their hostess and arranged themselves about the room. Dear me, there's no recognizing them. And Natasha! See whom she looks like. She really reminds me of somebody. But Herr Dimmler, isn't he good? I don't know him, and how he dances. Dear me, there's a Circassian. Really, how becoming it is to dear Sonia. And who is that? Well, you have cheered us up. Nikita and Vanya, clear away the tables. And here we were, sitting so quietly. Ha ha ha! The hussar, just like a boy. And the legs, I can't look at him, different voices were saying. Natasha, the young Meliukovs' favourite, disappeared with them into the back rooms, where a cork and various dressing gowns and male garments were called for, and received from the footman by bare girlish arms from behind the door. 10 minutes later, all the young Meliukovs joined the mummers. Pelagaya Danilovna, having given orders to clear the rooms for the visitors and arranged about refreshments for the gentry and the serfs, went about among the mummers without removing her spectacles, peering into their faces with a suppressed smile and failing to recognize any of them. It was not merely Dimmler and the Rostovs she failed to recognize. She did not even recognize her own daughters or her late husband's dressing gowns and uniforms which they had put on. "And who is this?" asked her governess, peering into the face of her own daughter dressed up like Kazan Tatar. "I suppose it is one of the Rostovs. Well, Mr. Hussar, and what regiment do you serve in?" she asked Natasha. "Here, hand some fruit jelly to the Turk," she ordered the butler who was handing things around. "That's not forbidden by his law." Sometimes she looked at the strange but amusing capers cut by the dancers, who, having decided once for all that being disguised no one would recognize them, were not at all shy. Pelagaya Danilovna hid her face with her handkerchief, and her whole stout body shook with irrepressible, kindly, elderly laughter. "My little Sasha, look at Sasha," she said. After Russian country dances and chorus dances, Pelagaya Danilovna made the serfs and gentry join in one large circle. A ring, a string, and a silver rouble were fetched, and they all played games together. In an hour all the costumes were crumpled and disordered. The corked eyebrows and moustaches were smeared over the perspiring, flushed, and merry faces. Pelagaya Danilovna began to recount the mummers, admired their cleverly contrived costumes, and particularly how they suited the young ladies, and she thanked them all for having entertained her so well. The visitors were invited to supper in the drawing-room, and the serfs had something served to them in the ballroom. "Now to tell one's fortune in the empty bath-house is frightening," said an old maid who lived with the Meliukovs during supper. "Why?" said the eldest Meliukov girl. "Oh, you wouldn't go. It takes courage." "I'll go," said Sonia. "Tell what happened to the young lady," said the second Meliukov girl. "Well," began the old maid, "a young lady once went out, took a cock, laid the table for two all properly, and sat down. After sitting a while, she suddenly hears someone coming. A sleigh drives up with harness bells. She hears him coming. He comes in, just in the shape of a man, like an officer, comes in and sits down to table with her." screamed Natasha, rolling her eyes in horror. "Yes, and how did he speak?" "Yes, like a man. Everything quite all right," he began persuading her, and she should have just kept him talking till cockcrow, but she got frightened, and hid her face in her hands, and then he caught her up. It was lucky the maids ran in then. "Now, why frighten them?" said Pelagaya Danilovna. "Mummy, you used to try fate yourself," said her daughter. "And how does one do it in a barn?" required Sonia. "Well, say you went into the barn now and listen. It depends on what you hear. Hammering or knocking, that's bad, but a sound of shifting grain is good, and sometimes one hears that too. Mama, tell us what happened to you in the barn. Pelagaya Danilovna smiled. Oh, I've forgotten, she replied. But none of you would go. Yes, I will, Pelagaya Danilovna. Let me. I'll go, said Sonia. Well, why not, if you're not afraid? Louise Ivanovna, may I? Asked Sonia. Whether they were playing the ring and string game, or the rouble game, or talking as now, Nicholas did not leave Sonia's side, and gazed at her with quiet new eyes. It seemed to him that it was only today, thanks to that burnt cork moustache, that he had fully learnt to know her, and really that evening Sonia was brighter, more animated and prettier than Nicholas had ever seen her before. I'm not afraid of anything, said Sonia. May I go at once? She got up. They told her where the barn was, and how she should stand and listen, and they handed her a fur cloak. She threw this over her head and shoulders and glanced at Nicholas. How darling that girl is, he thought, and what have I been thinking of till now? Sonia went out into the passage to go to the barn. Nicholas went hastily to the front porch, saying he felt too hot. The crowd of people really had made the house stuffy. Outside there was the same cold stillness and the same moon, but even brighter than before. The light was so strong, and the snow sparkled, and so many stars that one did not wish to look up at the sky, and the real stars were unnoticed. The sky was black and dreary, while the earth was gay. I'm a fool, a fool. What have I been waiting for? Thought Nicholas, and running out from the porch he went around the corner of the house and along the path that led to the back porch. He knew Sonia would pass that way. Halfway lay some snow-covered piles of firewood, and across and along them a network of shadows from the bare old lime trees fell on the snow and on the path. This path led to the barn. The log walls of the barn and its snow-covered roof, that looked as if hewn out of some precious stone, sparkled in the moonlight. A tree in the garden snapped with the frost, and then all was again perfectly silent. His bosom seemed to inhale not air, but the strength of eternal youth and gladness. From the back porch came the sound of feet descending the steps. The bottom step, upon which snow had fallen, gave a ringing creak, and he heard the voice of an old maid-servant saying, "Straight, straight along the path, miss, only don't look back." "I'm not afraid," answered Sonia's voice, and along the path towards Nicholas came the crunching, whistling sound of Sonia's feet in her thin shoes. Sonia came along, wrapped in her cloak. She was only a couple of paces away when she saw him, and to her too he was not the Nicholas she had known and always slightly feared. He was in a woman's dress with tousled hair and a happy smile new to Sonia. She ran rapidly towards him. Quite different and yet the same, thought Nicholas, looking at her face all lit up by the moonlight. He slipped his arms under the cloak that had covered her head, embraced her, pressed her to him, and kissed her on the lips that wore a moustache and had a smell of burnt cork. Sonia kissed him full on the lips, and disengaging her little hands, pressed them to his cheeks. "Sonia, Nicholas," was all that they said. They ran to the barn and then back again, re-entering, he by the front and she by the back porch. End of chapter 11. War and Peace, Book 7, Chapter 12, read for LibriVox.org by Elena. Chapter 12. When they all drove back from Pelagaya Danilovna's, Natasha, who always saw and noticed everything, arranged that she and Madame Schoss should go back in the sleigh with Dimmler and Sonia with Nicholas and the maids. On the way back, Nicholas drove at a steady pace instead of racing, and kept peering by that fantastic, all-transforming light into Sonia's face, and searching beneath the eyebrows and moustache for his former and his present Sonia, from whom he had resolved never to be parted again. He looked, and recognizing in her both the old and the new Sonia, and being reminded by the smell of burnt cork of the sensation of her kiss, inhaled the frosty air with a full breast, and, looking at the ground flying beneath him and at the sparkling sky, felt himself again in fairyland. "Sonia, is it well with thee?" he asked from time to time. "Yes," she replied, "and with thee?" Then halfway home, Nicholas handed the reins to the coachman and ran, for a moment, to Natasha's sleigh and stood on its wing. "Natasha," he whispered in French, "do you know I have made up my mind about Sonia?" "Have you told her?" asked Natasha, suddenly beaming all over with joy. "How strange that you are with that moustache and those eyebrows! Natasha, are you glad?" "I'm so glad, so glad. I was beginning to be vexed with you. I did not tell you, but you have been treating her badly. What a heart she has, Nicholas. I am horrid sometimes, but I was ashamed to be happy while Sonia was not," continued Natasha. "I am so glad. We'll run back to her." "No, wait a bit. How funny you look!" cried Nicholas, peering into her face, and finding in his sister too something new, unusual, and bewitchingly tender that he had not seen in her before. "Natasha, it's magical, isn't it?" "Yes," she replied. "You have done splendidly." "Had I seen her before as she is now," thought Nicholas, "I should long ago have asked her what to do, and have done whatever she told me, and all would have been well." "So you are glad, and I have done right?" "Oh, quite right. I had a quarrel with Mamma some time ago about it. Mamma said she was angling for you. How could she say such a thing? I nearly stormed at Mamma. I will never let anyone say anything bad of Sonia, for there is nothing but good in her." "Then it's all right?" said Nicholas, again scrutinizing the expression of his sister's face to see if she was in earnest. Then he jumped down, and his boots, scrunching on the snow, ran back to his sleigh. The same happy, smiling Circassian, with moustache and beaming eyes looked up from under the sable hood, was still sitting there, and that Circassian was Sonia, and that Sonia was certainly his future happy and loving wife. When they reached home and had told their mother how they had spent the evening at the Meliukovs, the girls went to their bedroom. When they had undressed, without washing off the cork moustaches, they sat a long time talking of their happiness. They talked of how they would live when they were married, how their husbands would be friends, and how happy they would be. On Natasha's table stood 2 looking-glasses which Dunyasha had prepared beforehand. "Only when will that be? I am afraid never. It would be too good," said Natasha, raising and going to the looking-glasses. "Sit down, Natasha. Perhaps you'll see him," said Sonia. Natasha lit the candles, one on each side of the looking-glasses, and sat down. "I see someone with a moustache," said Natasha, seeing her own face. "You mustn't laugh, miss," said Dunyasha. With Sonia's help and the maid's, Natasha got the glass she held into the right position opposite the other. Her face assumed a serious expression, and she sat silent. She sat a long time looking at the receding line of candles reflecting in the glasses, and expecting, from tales she had heard, to see a coffin, or him, Prince Andrew, in that last, dim, indistinctly outlined square. But ready as she was to take the smallest speck for the image of a man or of a coffin, she saw nothing. She began blinking rapidly and moving away from the looking-glasses. "Why is it others see things and I don't?" she said. "You sit down now, Sonia. You absolutely must, tonight. Do it for me. Today I feel so frightened." Sonia sat down before the glasses, got to the right position, and began looking. "Now, Miss Sonia, you're sure to see something," whispered Dunyasha. "Well, you do nothing but laugh." Sonia heard this and Natasha's whisper. "I know she will. She saw something last year." For about 3 minutes all were silent. "Of course she will," whispered Natasha, but did not finish. Suddenly Sonia pushed away the glass she was holding and covered her eyes with her hand. "Oh, Natasha!" she cried. "Did you see? Did you? What was it?" exclaimed Natasha, holding up the looking-glass. Sonia had not seen anything. She was just wanting to blink and to get up when she heard Natasha say, "Of course she will." She did not wish to disappoint either Dunyasha or Natasha, but it was hard to sit still. She did not herself know how or why the exclamation escaped her when she covered her eyes. "You saw him?" urged Natasha, seizing her hands. "Yes. Wait a bit. I saw him," Natasha could not help saying, not yet knowing whom Natasha meant by him, Nicholas or Prince Andrew. "But why shouldn't I say I saw something? Others do see. Besides, who can tell whether I saw anything or not?" flashed through Sonia's mind. "Yes, I saw him," she said. "How? Standing or lying?" "No, I saw... At first there was nothing. Then I saw him lying down." "Andrew lying? Is he ill?" asked Natasha, her frightened eyes fixed on her friend. "No, on the contrary, on the contrary. His face was cheerful and he turned to me, and when saying this she fancied she had really seen what she had described." "Well, and then, Sonia?" "After that I could not make out what there was, something blue and red." "Sonia, will he come back? When shall I see him? Oh God, how afraid I am for him, and for myself, and about everything." Natasha began, and without replying to Sonia's words of comfort, she got into bed, and long after her candle was out, lay open-eyed and motionless, gazing at the moonlight through the frosty window panes. End of chapter 12. War and Peace, Book 7, Chapter 13, read for LibriVox.org, by Aylmer. Chapter 13. Soon after the Christmas holidays, Nicholas told his mother of his love for Sonia and of his firm resolve to marry her. The countess, who had long noticed what was going on between them and was expecting this declaration, listened to him in silence, and then told her son that he might marry whom he pleased, but that neither she nor his father would give their blessing to such a marriage. Nicholas, for the first time, felt that his mother was displeased with him and that, despite her love for him, she would not give way. Coldly, without looking at her son, she sent for her husband and, when he came, tried briefly and coldly to inform him of the facts in her son's presence, but unable to restrain herself, she burst into tears of vexation and left the room. The old count began irresolutely to admonish Nicholas and to beg him to abandon his purpose. Nicholas replied that he could not go back on his word, and his father, sighing and evidently disconcerted, soon became silent and went in to the countess. In all his encounters with his son, the count was always conscious of his own guilt towards him for having wasted the family fortune, so he could not be angry with him for refusing to marry an heiress and for choosing the dowerless Sonia. On this occasion he was only more vividly conscious of the fact that if his affairs had not been discovered, no better wife for Nicholas than Sonia could have been wished for, and that no one but himself, with his Mitenka and his uncomfortable habits, was to blame for the condition of the family's finances. The father and mother did not speak of the matter to their son again, but a few days later the countess sent for Sonia and, with a cruelty neither of them expected, reproached her niece for trying to catch Nicholas and for ingratitude. Sonia listened silently with downcast eyes to the countess's cruel words, without understanding what was required of her. She was ready to sacrifice everything for her benefactors. Self-sacrifice was her most cherished idea, but in this case she could not see what she ought to sacrifice or for whom. She could not help loving the Countess and the whole Rostov family, but neither could she help loving Nicholas and knowing that his happiness depended on that love. She was silent and sad and did not reply. Nicholas felt the situation to be intolerable and went to have an explanation with his mother. He first implored her to forgive him and Sonia and consent to their marriage. Then he threatened that if she molested Sonia, he would at once marry her secretly. The Countess, with a coldness her son had never seen in her before, replied that he was of age and Prince Andrew was marrying without his father's consent, and that he could do the same, but that she would never receive the intriguer as her daughter. Exploding at the word intriguer, Nicholas raised his voice and told his mother that he had never expected her to try and force him to sell his feelings, but if that was so, then he would say for the last time. But he had no time to utter the decisive word, which the expression of his face caused his mother to await with terror, and which would perhaps have forever remained a cruel memory to them both. He had no time to say it, for Natasha, with pale and a set face, entered the room from the door at which she had been listening. "Nicholas, you are talking nonsense. Be quiet, be quiet, be quiet, tell you," she almost screamed, as if to drown his voice. "Mamma, darling, it's not at all so. My poor sweet darling," she said to her mother, who, conscious that they had been on the brink of a rupture, gazed at her son with terror, but in the obstinacy and excitement of the conflict could not and would not give way. "Nicholas, I'll explain to you." "Go away. Listen, Mamma, darling," said Natasha. Her words were incoherent, but they attained the purpose at which she was aiming. The Countess, sobbing heavily, hid her face on her daughter's breast, while Nicholas rose, clutching his head, and left the room. Natasha set to work to effect a reconciliation, and so far succeeded that Nicholas received a promise from his mother that Sonia should not be troubled, while he, on his side, promised not to undertake anything without his parents' knowledge. Firmly resolved, after putting his affairs in order in the regiment, to retire from the army and return and marry Sonia, Nicholas, serious, sorrowful, and at variance with his parents, but, as it seemed to him, passionately in love, left at the beginning of January to rejoin his regiment. After Nicholas had gone, things in the Rostov household were more depressing than ever, and the Countess fell ill from mental agitation. Sonia was unhappy at the separation from Nicholas, and still more so on account of the hostile tone the Countess could not help adopting towards her. The Count was more perturbed than ever by the condition of his affairs, which called for some decisive action. Their townhouse and estate near Moscow had inevitably to be sold, and for this they had to go to Moscow. But the Countess's health obliged them to delay their departure from day to day. Natasha, who had borne the first period of separation from her betrothed lightly, and even cheerfully, now grew more agitated and impatient every day. The thought that her best days, which she would have employed in loving him, were being vainly wasted with no advantage to anyone, tormented her incessantly. His letters for the most part irritated her. It hurt her to think that while she lived only in the thought of him, he was living a real life, seeing new places and new people that interested him. And more interesting his letters were, the more vexed that she felt. Her letters to him, far from giving her any comfort, seemed to her a wearisome and artificial obligation. She could not write because she could not conceive the possibility of expressing sincerely in a letter even 1,000th part of what she expressed by voice, smile, and glance. She wrote to him formal, monotonous, and dry letters, to which she attached no importance herself, and in the rough copies of which the Countess corrected her mistakes in spelling. There was still no improvement in the Countess's health, but it was impossible to defer the journey to Moscow any longer. Natasha's trousseau had to be ordered and the house sold. Moreover, Prince Andrew was expected in Moscow, where the old Prince Bolkonsky was spending the winter, and Natasha felt sure he had already arrived. So the Countess remained in the country, and the Count, taking Sonia and Natasha with him, went to Moscow at the end of January. End of chapter 13. Recording by Aylmer. End of War and Peace, Book 7, by Leo Tolstoy.